burning desire, big ideas, bold action.
Hello and welcome to the Boldly Now show. This is Michael Sean Conaway, and today I have the great pleasure of interviewing Tom Chi. Tom is a dear friend, longtime collaborator, the current founding partner of At One Ventures, and also currently the board chair of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. Tom Chi, welcome to the Boldly Now show.
Hey.
It's I think one of the qualities of being in conversation around things that really make a difference, or businesses or technologies or mindsets. The great thing about having a conversation with somebody over time, through time, is that we begin to have maybe a less than surface level understanding of things. And today I really want to take us a little bit deeper into the conversation of where do world-changing ideas come from? How does somebody take those ideas from a brainstorm into actual existence in the world? And I think maybe you might be one of the most qualified people I've ever talked to about this subject, having participated in the invention of Google Glass, the Project Loon, Google self-driving car, to name some small projects you were involved with in the past. And then since retiring and leaving Google, I know you've been involved with dozens of social impact technologies, or maybe I should say environmental impact or climate change impact technologies that, there again, seem tremendously inventive. So, for example, the tree planting drones. I get drones, I get tree planting. The spark between the two is like, how did somebody think of a drone to plant trees? That's incredibly inventive and creative. So let's pull back the covers a little bit on this and help our viewers to understand, if they have ideas, how might they nurture those ideas along to become, hopefully someday, world-changing ideas. So let's just start a little bit about, where do the ideas come from?
Yeah, I think one of the impediments to getting a world-changing thing underway is to be overwhelmed, where you basically say, oh my gosh, well, I'm trying to go deal with this huge problem in the world. There's all this agricultural runoff, which is poisoning all the oceans. It's such a huge problem. And you talk about all the tonnage, or, here's microplastics and such a huge problem, or whatever, on and on. Whatever the problem that really speaks to you is, by the time it makes the headlines such that it would become a real, source of anxiety or concern, then typically, the global scale of it is quite large. So one place where a lot of great ideas die is people get overwhelmed and they can't even begin approaching the ideas. And the thing that I like to teach folks about that is, at the core of any huge change, including these negative impacts that we're seeing in a lot of places, there is a little nucleus, of economics and technology and, human decision making that is working a particular way. And, it is natural for there to be so much, eutrophication from agricultural runoff, given the nucleus that's been designed there. And the nucleus itself actually tends to be kind of small and understandable, right? Like, why do farmers use so much fertilizer? Well, they haven't really invested that much in the soils recently, so they need the nutrients to come from fertilizer as opposed to through healthy soils. Well, okay, cool. What is the technology that is currently employed that allows that to happen, right? And if you just really stay close to the nucleus and don't worry quite yet about the absolute scale of the huge problem, if you stay real close to the nucleus, then all of those things are still human scale, right? There is a set of humans, 15 people in a lab worked on a particular, chemistry for this herbicide or this pesticide or this fertilizer or this whatever, right? The farmers that are making the decisions on their land, it's typically not some huge consortium where you need to convince a million politicians. It might be a family business farm, or on the larger scale, maybe it's a concern where there's maybe 4 or 5 decision makers, but still a very human scale. So like really zoom into the nucleus of what is this kind of little incentive and economic and technology machine that is at the heart of why this big negative effect is happening. And then ask yourself, okay, do I have any ideas that might change that nucleus a little bit? And that nucleus tends to be intrinsically approachable. It's like, well, I could pull together 15 people and come up with a different formulation here. Or I could, talk with a number of farmers, and from talking with a number of farmers, I can start to understand how they make decisions for their family business and how other farmers make decisions for their family business, and then start playing around with, well, how do we change, that decision process, that incentive structure a little bit? And this is kind of the starting point where you can go affect the nucleus that's at the core of the whole thing. And if and basically what you're proposing is an alternative nucleus, an alternative way that the economics and the technology and the human decision making and relationships works together. And if you can go make that work, and it has a lot of the beneficial properties that you want, then you basically have the core of something that can become, the sort of big ideas that then take over the defaults of the world.
Yeah, and I know we've talked before about locality as well. I think you told a story of like if you want to clean water all over the world at one time, there's really no access to cleaning all the world's water at one time. But if you look at a specific watershed, you can often find the sources of the pollution in a small watershed.
Yep. No, like a thing that I teach is the idea that specificity is the friend of innovation. So when you keep things up at the huge, issue level where it's like, here's 850 million people without access to electricity. Here's, almost 1 billion people without access to clean water, et cetera, then it sounds really impressive. Like maybe that'll get you on stage and people will listen, because it sounds real urgent and big. But on the flip side, that's not how you'd actually make traction on the problem. The way you'd actually make traction on the problem is to get real specific, where it's like, oh yeah, in a lower resource nation context, I was able to go visit, 30 places where they're having a lot of problems with clean water. And some of the themes that I saw were this, and this. And, some of the solutions that I saw that were making some difference were this, and this. So like a thing that I might propose for, lower resource nations where people get all their drinking water and washing water and what have you from a river system or a stream system nearby is blah. And all this is just filling in the specificity that enables the innovation.
Right. So we get specific. Sometimes that's geographical. Sometimes that's finding the nucleus. And then you just said something that I really like there is that before you started looking for an innovative solution, you started looking for solutions that were already working. I think sometimes we get this kind of idea, the kind of John Wayne Western individualistic thing, like I've got to be the hero and come up with the one solution. And often it's just accelerating or amplifying or scaling a solution that's already working out there sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know, and I think if you do that well enough, people will call you real innovative too. Like multi-touch screens were invented 15 years before, Steve Jobs did the demo of the iPhone. And yet he still gets a lot of credit for like, well, you kind of brought it to the masses. And actually, I think that there's credit to be deserved on all fronts, right? I think that's fantastic that he took it out of, human computer interaction research labs, from the late 90s and then brought it into a thing where it's like, oh yeah, now a lot of people can use this thing.
Yeah, and it also just occurs to me a bit, and we'll get on with kind of innovations and how you move forward with that in a second, but also occurs to me a bit is if there's some problem that you care about, you mentioned clean water, let's take that for example. You really care about clean water and cleaning up the water around the planet. There's lots of opportunities for you to contribute in a way that's not you being the one coming up with the idea or accelerating an idea. It can be that you contribute by joining somebody else's project. And I think that's something that in kind of a do-good mindset, we forget that we can go find a job or a startup or any other number of things that have already launched an idea or come up with a concept. And so it seems to me that like being specific, looking for solutions that are already out there, maybe joining a team of people that are working on a certain solution you're aligned with, all should be things maybe you would do before you're in the business of generating a very original proposal.
Yeah, I heard a thing once, somebody else was giving a talk about the number of nonprofits that had been put together to protect, this diminishing species of rhino. And they were like, there's more nonprofits to protect the rhino than there are rhinos. And it's like, oh, maybe we got that wrong then. It's like we should join forces a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and it's a little bit of an old model that, like you're the one that's going to lead the charge on something. And maybe the new model is more about collaboration and trying to fit pieces of the puzzle together. And even if you think about the tree planting drone, there's, I don't think, did it require any big technological innovations in that, or is it was just putting a bunch of different pieces together in a way it hadn't been thought of before?
I'm going to say that, in the grand scheme of things, that one was medium to medium hard, because you're dealing with something that is biological and you're wanting a biological thing to survive. So if it was just mechanical to mechanical, then it would just be like a low to medium kind of integration. But since there's other elements to it, like wanting to make sure that the mycorrhizal mix and the underground microbiome was healthy, as well as the above ground, and to be able to have a lot of different species survive in a lot of different settings, then and support that with machines and artificial intelligence and robotics, then yeah, it moved into the medium hard range.
And give us the name of that company, because some of our viewers might want to look that up. I know you've invested in them over time.
Yeah, that's called Dendra Systems.
So if you're interested in like massively scalable forestation, please go look that up. Let's talk about another one that I know you invested in, the robot fish, because I think that's another one. We talked about dirty water supplies, and you talk about fish farming and how that really spoils, especially these bays where they do the farming. Talk to us a little bit about that and how that idea came about, and then was that an easy solution or a hard solution, and what's the progress on that one?
I think that one's very interesting. I ended up not placing the investment in that one, but it's nothing against the team for sure. I was still in the process of raising my fund and a bunch of other things. But, in terms of what that is, it's basically, actually, it's some really quality robotics work that basically made a robot that swims like a fish, can swim amongst fish without causing any particular alarm, allows you to go and do open ocean. Well, it's still netted in, but it's in the open ocean, like aquaculture, without having to put lots of sensors everywhere, because the fish has sensors on it. It can just swim around to different places in that area. So it brings down the cost of that type of aquaculture quite a bit. But yeah, the status of that is they were doing a bunch of pilot and some early commercial stuff in Norway, because basically in Norway and off of the coast of Chile and one other place in the world, they're doing a decent amount of this type of aquaculture.
Yeah, well, and obviously the fish farming can be very toxic to local environments and local watersheds.
Yeah, so if you concentrate, so most aquaculture is done near shore or in a bay, and all the effluent, all the fish poo basically gets dumped right into the water in a concentrated spot. The benefit of some of these, more open ocean ones is that you're in a place where the waste is more easily diffused and carried away, as opposed to when it's concentrated in a bay or it's concentrated in a onshore facility and then dumped out through a pipe. Then it's tends to reach levels that the ecosystem is not easily able to make sense of.
Yeah. I'm just, since we're on this kind of roll right now, is there anything that you're looking at or have just invested into that kind of demonstrates this little bit of genius? The robot fish is like, it's just kind of genius to, instead of make the fish stay where you want them to stay, you just follow them around with a robot, and that way you always know where they are. Is there anything else like that you can share with us today that's like another really just genius little small idea that actually might have a large impact?
Well, one of our recent investments is in a company called Climax Foods, and they're basically, the way that most companies have approached figuring out plant-based alternatives to animal-based foods is just kind of in the test kitchen environment, where it's like, well, we have a bunch of soy and we have some starch, and let's combine it with so and so, and maybe if we could combine soy and starch in the right way, it'll kind of taste like cheese. And it takes a while, so there's all these iterations to go do, and the taste arguably is not necessarily that close, and the nutritional value is oftentimes quite different than the thing it's replacing. And what Climax Foods is doing is they're basically characterizing all these plant-based food ingredients and a way wider variety than just corn, soy, like the wheat, like the ones that are kind of industrial food basics, more like hundreds of potential plant ingredients, and then they are characterizing all the flavor and physical properties, protein analysis, on, and that basically gives them a really sophisticated database. And then what they do is they'll take an animal-based food, like let's say a blue cheese, and then they'll go analyze it through gas chromatography, mass spec, a bunch of different ways of analyzing, what's in it. And then they basically have created a machine learned algorithm that can parse the entire space of all plant-based ingredients in order to spit out, here's the recipe for the way to combine plants that gets you closest to the taste of blue cheese. And it can compute something like that in a day, as opposed to, a food science team might work on that for nine months to a year. So just the task of being able to go and look at a lot of the foods that we've just assumed have to be animal-based and replace them with plant-based foods, that team has made it possible to speed up that task by a factor of 100. So I think that's, some actual genius at work.
Yeah, and are they planning on making the food themselves, or just being a service to other food-based companies that want to make the food?
They've already made a bunch of test foods, and I've had a bunch of it, and it's honestly really delicious, and it tastes very, very close to the thing. And they basically had done some blind taste tests, and people complained at them. It's like, I thought you weren't going to give me a dairy-based blue cheese, and it's like, we didn't. And it's like, okay, well, that's a very complex flavor that you guys were able to hone in on to the point that it confused somebody, in a positive way. They thought it was actually just blue cheese.
Right. And just, for our listeners to keep in mind, plant-based farming is far, far more sustainable than animal-based farming. Obviously, the kind of farming really matters. That's a problem for another innovator to deal with. And obviously, there's lots of them out in the space and making animal-based foods more sustainable. And then, of course, as we talked before, how do we not have so much have better soil and build better soil to do better.
Yeah, there's many solutions that we're going to need to put into place to go redo agriculture, but basically agriculture needs a full redo. Like we have made ourselves super unhealthy, and we've made the planet super unhealthy with the way that we've done it. And, whether it is the reduction of, animal-based products that are created in a particular way, or whether it's the, production of livestock and animal-based products in a way that is soil regenerative and land regenerative, then that's another avenue that is going to be important in the reboot of the food system. What it's definitely not going to be is what we're doing right now, where the little nuclei is all around subsidized, large-scale monocropping that requires tons of inputs, and most of that food we don't even eat. Like, people are like, well, if we didn't do this, how would we eat? And it's like, the majority of the food that's produced in that way in the US actually just becomes feed for livestock and input for biofuels and some material production. Like, we eat almost none of it. So, like, all the arguments that are coming from big ag, where it's like, we won't be able to feed the world unless we do this industrial monocropping with tons of pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides. That's just actually untrue. You can go graze the land, and that is replacing the way that you are feeding your livestock. And you can graze the land in a way that restores the land. And if you remove animal feed and biofuels, the floor already fell out from under it unless it's highly subsidized. But unless unless you like force us to go and stick with that stuff, like 85% of the farming that we're doing is instantly going to not be needed because we'll be working with livestock or have plant-based replacements or use cellular agriculture in order to replace how we're getting a lot of the protein from meats. And biofuels, the floor already fell out because global oil prices are real low right now.
Great. And I just want to say that we've kind of done in our conversation here what you talked about. You find a nuclei, you make an impact. So we just talked a little bit about somebody who's making plant-based foods that taste like animal-based foods, and making progress on that. And then we talked a little bit about how we do livestock or we do plants. And you can see how there's a lot of these little nuclei, as you called them, or crux points that if we can make an impact here, here, and here, we could set the whole system up for evolution, which wouldn't require somebody to sit down with a pencil and paper and draw the whole revolution out. We don't have to have the whole thing. But there are these levers, and I'm really interested in that. And I know one of the things you declare about this, this piece is, that human beings should be able to produce increasing topsoil quality across the planet. So better and better topsoil. Is that something that's just an easy way to help people understand what you're trying to impact when it comes down to the way we use land and food? Or is it just as simple as that? If we actually looked at everything we did and it was making an increase in topsoil across the board, we would eventually have the revolution we were looking for in food and agriculture.
That is definitely a thing to look for, in food and agriculture. Like if you are going to continue to grow outdoors, then is it restoring the soil? And that's true both for the livestock and for cropland. The other, major fork on this, and both of these are different than what's happening today because we have outdoor agriculture that depletes soil. So there's one branch that goes to outdoor agriculture, animal and plant agriculture that restores soil, and that's productive for a number of reasons. And then there's another, branch that brings a bunch of that indoors. So if you look at the Dutch greenhouses sort of work, the Netherlands, I think, is the third largest exporter of food in the world, even though it's a super tiny country. And it outstrips, Canada, which is a huge country. So what they're doing there is they're doing mostly indoor greenhouse agriculture, and they are doing it in controlled settings, and they're making lots of high value crops in the process of doing that, and produce and flowers and all that sort of thing. So I do think that there's going to be a bifurcation as well. And that is, of course, is less soil regenerative, but it does grow a lot of the stuff that we need for a really small footprint.
Right. Yeah. And they have really cloudy weather a lot of the time as well. So they don't have a lot of sunlight. Well, great. So I think we've kind of tackled the little first piece here. We teased out, if you're looking for, there's something you want to impact, be it the soil, as we've talked about, or clean water, we talked about, maybe air, or maybe some human-centered issue or problem that we're facing. The first thing is to get really specific. And then with the specificity, one of those pieces of specificity may be locality. Not only what is the root of the issue, but what is the root of the issue in a very specific place. We should be looking to research and find out, what are the solutions that are being tried? Are there solutions that are being successful? Are there multiple angles and solutions that might be able to be put together? Drones plus tree planting type things.
And you want to shake things up, and you can shake it up through technology. So, for example, let's bring some robotics and AI into this mix, or drones are an example of that. Or you might mix up, let's change the incentives about how this farm cooperative works, right? And that's not new technology, but that's basically people working together economically in a different way. And in whatever the change that you bring, whether it's a change to business model or human relationships or technology, then you ask yourself, well, in the presence of us beginning to do it in this other way, does it change the economic equation in an interesting way? And the things that end up, winning, at least in a world where we have this global economy, and there's a whole longer story of whether we're going to reach an arc where we have a lot more local and regional economies as opposed to one super global economy. But we'll just leave that for a separate day because that's not a thing that people work on by just doing the nucleus work. And really, the nucleus work eventually makes it easier to do those bigger changes. But like, put that aside for a second. You ask yourself, well, with the changes that I'm doing, whether it be around relationship or business model or technology, how does the economics change because of this? And if the economics end up being less expensive for the same or higher quality of good, then you have the nucleus that you could get real interested in scaling.
So specificity, locality, find other solutions that are going on and look for things that change the economic model.
And you should experiment with it. Like, it may not be cheaper on day one, but you want to experiment with it, try to actually do it in practice. And as you do it in practice, you start to understand, oh man, like, well, we're wasting a lot of money on this little piece. Well, let's go change that. Oh, well, now that we fixed that, we're within 20% of parity of current economic prices. Oh, that's pretty great. Oh, there's this one other thing we wanted to tweak. Boom, we tweaked it. Now we're 5% cheaper than what people are doing in the world. And the quality is higher and the community is benefited and. Well, now go and scale it. Like, I think a lot of people run into headwinds when they try to just have an idea that presents really well on stage. And then they're like, well, look at all the positive responses I got. So now it's time to scale it. And it's like, well, no, like, in a world where we still have a global economy, then the things that are more expensive just don't scale as quickly, especially when you're talking about the raw material that goes and just like the nuclei that run the majority of the world. And a lot of times on the impact side, people will say like, well, we'll kind of start at the luxury end and people that are willing to pay a premium for the impact. But intrinsically, that's going to be more niche than the majority of people. So
and not likely to be a world changing experiment.
Yeah, I mean, you might nudge 1% or 2%, and that's better than 0. But if what you were trying to go tackle was the things that are a problem to 100 million or 1 billion people, then you typically don't get there in a niche market.
Yeah, and I remember that. I mean, there's also just solutions that you said that sound good on stage, but are just wildly impractical. We talked about air scrubbing technologies, and you were saying that the raw materials would make us mine more material out of the planet than we ever mined before to clean the air.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is specifically around the accelerated weathering via olivine grinding. And look, I mean, could you go and capture some carbon like that? For sure. Could you pay off a 1 trillion ton debt with it, of carbon dioxide that's up in the atmosphere? Not unless you're willing to, 100x the amount of mining that we're doing on the planet, which has its own ecological impacts. So,
yeah. So making other things worse to make one thing good versus like the tree planting drone idea doesn't have any externalities like that. There's no collateral damage, so to speak.
At least the way that we're doing it, then we are not seeing that because we're seeing healthy ecosystems come up. We always work with a local ecologist in order to go figure out what's the right mix of species. We're not planting any monocultures. So we plant the correct mix of species for the stage of ecological succession that is that land is ready for. And we think about the above ground and below ground biodiversity. So, yeah, I mean, compared to the ways we have been doing it, then yeah, there is no apparent negative impact and a lot more apparent positive impacts than how we've currently been doing this work.
And I just want to call out for our listeners, you're not planting monocultures of trees. The point is not to plant 1 trillion trees that are one kind of tree or even one kind of tree for bioreasons. You're actually looking for biodiversity. Actually, maybe you may be saying instead of planting trees, you're planting ecologies.
Yeah, this is why we call them eco-restoration drones. It's like you try to restore the whole ecology. Because at the end of the day, the most robust systems and the ones that also store the most carbon are the ones that are actually healthy ecosystems that are appropriate for that biome.
Great. So Now, you actually mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, like once you start to get an idea and you figure out something to work on, then you've actually got to go work on it. Talk to us a little bit about how do you design iterative processes or prototyping processes where you can understand if the things you're trying are actually making the intended impact. And I understand maybe a scientist or an engineer would have a better crack at this, but a lot of entrepreneurs don't have those backgrounds in general. Maybe they're coming from tech into another area. Like, how do they begin to look at that world? And I think two parts of that too, Tom. What is that internally? What that's like for me? How do I have to see the world differently to do that? And then what are just some of the steps I can take that are small enough steps to see if my hypothesis is true in practical experience?
Yeah. So, I teach rapid prototyping to folks, and there's basically 3 domains that you could be rapid prototyping in. And that is the domain of atoms, and the domain of bits, and the domain of neurons. And basically between those 3 domains, like pretty much any business in the world can be effectively prototyped. And in order to go break that down a little bit, atoms are when a physical thing needs to be different or physical atoms need to move somewhere, then that's a place where you might want to prototype, with an atoms focused type prototype. When it's about the displaying of digital information or the running of algorithms or, the routing of information, then that's where you might be prototyping with bits. And when it's about, human relationships and thought processes and conversations and all that sort of thing, that's where you prototype in the domain of neurons. And basically for each one of those 3, domains, then I have a whole suite of techniques on like, okay, great. You are doing atoms and it's in the biosciences. Oh, you're doing atoms and it's in mechanical engineering. Oh, you're doing atoms and it's in, energy process heat. And, we can go talk about like, how to go prototype that. But the general gist of prototyping is how do I get the most learning out for the least amount of effort in? So there is one sense of prototyping where it's like the prototype is like, we worked 2 years on this prototype, because they're using the word in the sense of it's kind of the small version of exactly what we're going to build. And that's not the sense that I'm using this word in. In my sensibility, the verb prototype is really the act of learning the most for the least effortful experiment. And, the kind of brainstorming that you have around atoms, you might say, well, great. At the end of the day, what is the part that actually needs to happen? What needs to move where and what way? And what is the cheapest way that we could just try out anything like that? And then you spend, I don't know, half an hour brainstorming that, as opposed to spending weeks and weeks trying to go spec out a mini version of the full system. And you also don't try to go prototype everything in your final business on day one. You really zoom in on the parts that are the higher risk areas. So we talked a little bit about atoms. Let's move over to neurons for a second. So maybe one of your high risk areas is, oh, well, my product or service is not going to work until these, local government, authorities and, folks in power, like, are really excited about adopting it. And that's like a neurons issue, right? It basically like, what is the set of conversations that I need to have to be able to go understand what they care about and to go and talk about what we're hoping to do in a way that is exciting to them and really makes, an impact on the things that they care about as well. And what I teach people to do is a type of prototyping. It's, for neurons, a lot of times it is some form of conversational prototyping, where we basically say, no, actually, before we go and you go build up this whole program and try to raise money for it and hire 15 team members or whatever, let's just go find somebody who's like this public official. And we're going to go prototype this conversation you're going to have with them. And sometimes people freak out. It's like, oh no, but if I blow it with, the public officials in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I'm from, then we've blown it. And it's like, oh, I got it. It sounds like a real high risk situation. Prototyping is also about reducing the stakes for experiments so that you're not, that you don't get like crazily anxious and you're afraid to do them. So an example of how you might work around that is, let's go pick a former public official who's been out of office for more than 5 years. They still think about a lot of the same things. They still understand that mindset fully. But if you blow it with them, you've blown it with nobody, right? There's no, you lose no business. You have like created no black mark on your record. And that might be a way for you to, as an advisor, they might be able to, run a number of conversational prototypes with you that kind of gets you in that right territory. So you're within plus or minus 20% of the conversations that you'll actually need to have with those public officials that are currently in office.
And would you recommend with that in this case, hypothetical case for this retired official, would you recommend that you come to them like saying what you care about and then saying, I need your help prototyping conversations that'll excite people? Do you actually let them in on the game?
Yeah, no, like I would let them know. It's like, hey, I'm trying to build this, and this. I know that you got a background in so and so, and I'd love to get your feedback. And in a COVID world, we need to do this part of it a little bit differently. But pre-COVID, like a really simple tactic was like, oh, hey, would you be open? I'll take you out to lunch on the first Wednesday of every month. And then a lot of folks are like, oh, free lunch, and that's pretty cool. Like, yeah. And it's like, we're going to talk about the thing, and I'll run a couple prototypes by you in the last 20 minutes of lunch or whatever. And a lot of people are going to say yes to that. It's a relatively small time commitment. And especially if their input is leading to tangible changes over time. And the reason I separate those things, by a month is typically after a month of doing prototypes, the thing has improved a lot. So by the next time they hear it, they're like, oh, well, you guys have made a lot of changes. It's really exciting. And then the advanced tactic here is don't do that with just one official. Pick 4 of them. And then the second one is on the second Wednesday of the month. And the third one is on the third Wednesday of the month. And the fourth is on the fourth Wednesday of the month. And now you're getting effectively customer feedback every single week. But nobody feels overburdened because you're not asking them for stuff every single day. And when they do see it again after a month, then they're excited because a lot of things have been improved.
Yeah, that's great. And I think this is really helpful for our audience a lot. There's a lot of people that want to make impacts on social issues versus technological issues, which tend to be, for the most part, your area specialty. But really to think of a conversation as a prototype is very, very powerful. And you start to really get a clear sense, or at least I do from this conversation, that, oh, so there's really, really small steps I can take and prototype on and get feedback on and make sure they're ready to go before I move on to the next step. That seems smart.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes people say, well, I don't have any access. I can't even get to these people. And then there's a special technique on this too, which is if there's an important person that you want to reach out to, or a type of person that you want to reach out to, then what I often do is I will go search for talks that they've done. Maybe they were on a panel at a conference, maybe they've published an article to Medium, some sort of thing that they put out to the world. And I will reach out to them, but specifically, talking about the thing that they had put out in the world. And and specificity is the friend of innovation in this case too, because you don't just say, hey, I loved your talk at so-and-so conference. Can we connect sometime? That's not specific enough. What you want to do is like, hey, I watched your talk on so-and-so and I've spent the last 2 years of my life like really getting up to speed on this area. I found this part really fascinating. I had a different take on this part. I was thinking this, and I'd love to talk more about this third part. And people respond better when they know that you have self-qualified in terms of putting the time in, right? Because if I'm answering an email and just the person, it was just a fan of a talk, it's like, whatever. I mean, who knows if that's going to be productive? But if it's clear that they've spent, some real time and energy thinking about this, and it's clear from the feedback that they're giving me about my talk or my essay or whatever, then it's like, yeah, I'll spare a half hour. Let's talk about this thing.
Yeah, great. And wonderful feedback there. Don't just expect because you've got a passion to impact something or change something that's going to make a difference. What makes a difference is you doing the work, putting the time in to make sure that your thinking is clear, you understand the problem in a full way, and you can be articulate in what you see as an opportunity. These things are all homework. They're like table stakes, if you will. You have to at least get to that point to begin to have the conversations that really matter. And I don't think that's a bad thing. If it takes you a couple of years to prepare yourself, like to learn the things you need to learn, maybe you don't know something about AI and AI is a part of your thing. Maybe you actually have to learn about it and get yourself up to speed. I think that's okay too. And a lot of times, Tom, I find that people get urgent about things and they don't actually accept the fact that some things take time. And I think the course you're prescribing says you got to do the things you got to do in order to be successful.
I think if you talk to anybody who's accomplished anything of note, then they will basically tell you that it took a bit longer, or sometimes a lot longer than it looks like in the press. So that's just, I find that to be a comforting thought, because I work on a lot of issues that are quite urgent. And I also know a bunch of people that have helped to make really important changes in the world, and kind of the story of how they got there and the time that it took. But before folks get discouraged about how much homework you need to do before you can even talk to somebody, I think the stat is that on average, Americans read like 1 or 2 books a year. So like adults, like people that are out of school. Like if you're in school, you just have to read books as part of being in school. But like once you're out of school, it's a really, really low average, in at least in the US. And it means that if you were to dedicate yourself to read 3 books on one subject within 2 months, then you would be way ahead of most people and, like the average person in your understanding. Now, you're not near the level of a person who's been working on this day to day for 10 years, but like already that difference is enough that somebody who's been working on this from 10 years will know that you're not coming totally blank. You're not coming with totally wrong ideas, scientifically ungrounded, no background in the space. So even taking the 2 months to go read 3 books on a thing, kind of puts you into the position, at least I can talk to some people now. Yeah.
Great. And kind of the last step of this I want to talk about is getting evidence for your ideas. I run into a lot of people that have big ideas about stuff based upon just conjecture. Like there's really no evidence for what they're saying at all, but because they believe so passionately in the idea of the thing they're talking about, they talk about it like it's true. Like the idea, which may be unproven in any way, is a true idea. Let's talk a little bit about like getting real and saying, okay, I have an idea, and then giving evidence. Like how do you go about building things that give you evidence to find out whether your idea is actually a valid idea or not?
Yeah, for sure. And I think we kind of messed it up a little bit in that we really talk about like these passionate entrepreneurs and how charismatic they are and all that sort of thing. And I have kind of like more of, and at this point I'm a professional investor, so I like meet lots of entrepreneurs all the time. And even before that, I had already worked with a couple thousand entrepreneurs in my life. And I really look at like that kind of charisma as neutral. Like people can have it, and actually sometimes it can be a problem. I call it charisma distortion, because the person is so convinced that, investors get convinced, but then the reality on the ground is that it doesn't work, right? And you can say things that you would love to be true. Like right now, there's folks that would love it to be the case that we didn't need to wear masks, that masks were completely ineffective, because it's inconvenient. It is inconvenient, duh. Like it's easier to do nothing than it is to do something. But like, unfortunately, this is we are in a pandemic for a respiratory disease that is spread easily through, breathing, coughing, laughing, singing, all these sorts of things. And mask makes a huge difference. So it doesn't matter how charismatic you are around a wrong belief. And actually that can create a distortion for you. So I tend to encourage folks to say, well, great, I get that you're really passionate. And honestly, there's no issue with having a lot of passion with the thing. A lot of times it can be really fantastic. But like you need to make a distinction between commitment versus attachment to your idea.